Did you know that all experiences in your life are for you? Welcome to Soul Musings, exploring and embracing higher perspectives with me, Dr. Connie. Discover how every experience is an opportunity for spiritual expansion when we observe and use them from the higher perspective of our soul. Explore how we can create more alignment in our lives by focusing on the essence of the experience we want, rather than the form. Learn about ways of living and working together that can build a more harmonious and cooperative world. In each episode, we share awarenesses and tools that you can use in your own soul's journey to create more love, peace, and joy. Soul Musings starts now. So, hi everyone, welcome to Soul Musings, exploring and embracing higher perspectives. And like always, we're going to just start by doing a centering exercise. Maybe put your hand on your heart, close your eyes if you want. And just imagine the highest, clearest light that you can see from way up, the highest place you can imagine, coming down through you to the earth, through the top of your head, through all the levels of your consciousness, into all the body systems and cells of the body, bringing its love, peace, joy, connecting you back into that divine essence that you are as you just breathe it in, and then exhale anything that you no longer need. And then in your own perfect timing, just come present with us. So today's episode is on creating harmony and synergy through effective collaborative decision-making. What does that mean, and what are we going to be talking about? Well, I wanted to do this episode because if I look around the world right now, and honestly, even throughout history, there's a lot that is about domination, againstness, versus cooperation and collaboration for solutions that work not just for the strongest or the most powerful, but that actually work for everyone. And for me, this is a higher perspective because, in essence, we are all one on the spiritual level. And if something only works for one of us or part of us, it's really not working for us, the whole. It affects the whole and the whole vibration of the world that we live in. So the question is, how do we put into practice that awareness of our oneness in how we approach decisions we make and choices that we make, and finding solutions that could create a more harmonious and peaceful world? And to me, however we do that in our own lives as individual, I believe affects the whole, that there is an energy and a vibration that we hold and that we put out into the world by what we choose and how we do that. And especially if we are looking for answers that serve the highest good of all concerned, that's an energetic that will also be present for others to resonate with in the world. So I'm really happy to have with us today Jack Reed, who is someone that some of you know from other podcasts. And he's a perfect person to talk about this because, as you can see from his background, he's written a book called The Next Evolution, a blueprint for transforming the planet, that is really about this idea of how do we create a world that works for everyone. And part of his nonprofit Community Planet Foundation, with whom I've worked for years, we've worked with consensus. And in fact, as I understand it, Jack, you've actually used the consensus process to develop the ideas for the book with a group that was looking at fleshing out this higher vision. So what is consensus? How did you use that? We've used a definition. Maybe you can share that with us and how you use that.
Yes, as we've defined consensus as it's a co-creative process in which individuals or a group aspire to align with the highest good in order to craft a solution to which all can commit, and that includes the perspectives and concerns of all and all those who could be affected by whatever decision we're making.
Yeah, that's an important part because we can decide for ourselves what would work, but how does that affect others? And we're going to get into that a little bit more. But I just want to make a short comment because there's a way in which the word consensus, I think, has gotten a little bit of a bad rap in the sense that there's something called like a consensus reality, a narrative that's in the culture and the society or the world. And often that there's a lot of any resistance to that, to other ideas or other perspectives, can be squelched or punished. I mean, years ago, Galileo, who brought forward the idea that the Earth was not the center of the universe, was actually imprisoned for that. And there are places and situations where people that are expressing dissent can be, again, cracked down on, or however you want to say that. And that's not the consensus we're talking about. It's not a decision made on high of this is what's real. It's something that people come together to creatively craft from all their different perspectives. And the other way I see this as a higher perspective for this show is that it's there are techniques, there's a whole flow chart, there's a lot of different exercises we have when we teach it, but mostly, and Jack, I think you'd agree with this, it's a consciousness. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of approaching ourselves, our worlds, and each other. It speaks to the shared experience that we're having here on the planet and a way of being in the world that assumes our oneness, where everyone counts, everyone is heard, everyone is respected. It's a focus on building those relationships, a community that is deeply engaged, which is interesting. These days, there's a lot of superficial connection, and, what about deep connection? It's a way of expressing loving, actually, and because there's a deep listening, creating community and partnership, and even reflecting the needs of all. Not just one leader or one group or one powerful minority, or even the majority forcing their will on a minority without considering the needs of the others. So in this consciousness, everyone also cares that things work for everybody else. It's not like, well, I got mine, so, if you get more powerful than me, then maybe you'll get yours. And even considering, as we said, not just those that are making decision, but considering their actions on those that are not directly involved in the co-creative process. It reminds me of a vision or a book by Riane Eisler called The Chalice and the Blade. And she looked at cultures and societies throughout history and said, regardless of the economic or political organization, what she saw is cultures that were dominating, where, how do we vie for power and who dominates who and who gets to call the shots and make the rules, or those that were partnering, who would come together and jointly support each other in things that worked for the whole. And that's really the assumption behind the consensus model and indeed the community planet vision that Jack created. Often when I watch decision making, and you might identify with this, people are competing, trying to convince the other to support their point of view, see their perspective, do it their way, and who can be the greatest influencer, persuader, or maybe kind of a trade-off or tit for tat, but maybe with things that work for neither party or neither group, just that maybe there is that kind of working together, but not in a way that looks at a creative way of putting it together. So
can you give some examples of how to incorporate people affected by the decisions?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good idea to say. When I said that, I was thinking of, for instance, a business decision that talks about a wonderful creative idea, but in the process of manufacturing it may actually pollute the community it's working with in a very toxic way. And so including the decision making should be, how are we going to do this so that, in fact, it doesn't negatively impact the community, whether it's an environmental concern, a financial concern, or something else. Build that in as part of the creative solution. Also, I'm trying to think of another one. It can be just a simple thing like a family or a school decision where you're actually looking at how the children are affected. Sometimes, I've seen creative schools where, the kids are brought in with the adults and part of that to express it. But if that's not practical, you can actually just in working with the situation, stop and say, okay, how does this affect these others? Who else is affected? What about you? Do you have examples of that you can think of?
Yeah, I'm thinking of governing body decisions,
Okay.
taking
Yeah.
into account how future generations would be affected.
Ah, right.
Uh, For for instance, with our community planet group, when we were putting together the vision of a world that would work for everyone, we
Mhm.
went to the Iroquois model where they considered the effect of 7 generations down the line, and
Wow.
decisions would have to include that. And that's what we used in developing the community planet vision.
Hmm. Wow, that's a really very intense, broad way of looking at a solution and of the whole. I really love that. I had heard of that, and I'm glad that was the basis of what you were doing. Um, so I'm thinking of a couple examples too. I used some, we weren't actually calling it consensus. We called it problem solving and decision making, but we used the principles of consensus. And it was in an organization when I was doing organization development. And it was with a very successful construction company but that every construction site had only three members of the company, a superintendent, a customer service, and a salesperson, and all the other work was done by subcontractors. And inevitably, there were certain conflicts that would occur. And mostly it was the attitude of the subcontractors did this, the subcontractors didn't do this, or they would say, the management did this, they didn't do that. And it was kind of a stalemate. Of course, ultimately, on some levels, the contractor had more power, so they could do that. But since we were implementing this joint decision making collaboration within the organization, they could have just gotten together as they did in their departments to make departmental things work better. And they could have just said, okay, how do we make the subcontractors do this better? Show up on time, do this better, do that better, have lower bids. And we encourage them with this model of saying, why don't we bring the subcontractors in, since they are obviously affected by the decision and affect the decision, and use a cooperative model with the goal of how do we make the site more effective together. And it was actually a wonderful, first of all, shift in how you frame the issue that you're trying to problem solve, right? Not trying to problem solve through blame and correcting somebody else, but seeing what the joint vision is that you have, and then how do you work collaboratively. It worked out wonderfully for the company because they actually, with the subs influence of having plans earlier and planning meetings, they actually reduced the construction schedule, which of course is bottom line money for the company. Because the schedule had been designed on just keeping all the subs apart so there wouldn't be conflict, without the assumption they could come together and work cooperatively to actually make things better. And that's one of the principles. The synergy is that when you really do have more input, and with all the levels and all of the people involved, you really do get better solutions. We work with that in the training we do on consensus, where we give people an exercise they do individually, then they do the same thing with the group. The group results are always better. When we train them on more interaction consensus skills, the results are even better yet. And, to me, it's like a simple thing about the elephant. Like, if you, Jack, you might see the trunk, I might see the tusk, somebody else. It's like we don't really have the whole picture. If we start putting those together, we get a much more comprehensive vision, and we can address that in a much more comprehensive way. What else? It could be as simple as a couple. I was working with a couple, and they were dealing with just, you watch sports too much. You're always you're always in front of the TV watching sports. Well, you can fight about that and try to do some trade-offs. Or you might say another really important aspect is look at a deeper issue. Is it the noise that I'm upset with hearing? Is it that we're not spending enough quality time together? Those might be legitimate concerns, but how do we build those into a solution that we can both agree to rather than just fighting it out? can you, as someone who watches sports, Jack, can you think of some things that actually might be a solution incorporating those concerns?
Well, if it's a noise thing, I could have some earmuffs
Or earphones?
or earphones, or you could have earmuffs and I could have earphones. It's one thing, or we might go out and instead I might be interested instead of watching, participating in sports that would have my interest just as much as watching something or more.
Got it. So we're going to look at some things that go into helping that consensus process of a co-creative attitude and approach work better so that it maximizes both the synergy and the quality of the results. Um, why don't you share something you used with the group?
Yeah, one important thing before starting any decision-making process with however many people you're starting it with is something that we call a check-in, because in coming to making a decision, there could be distractions that are going on in our consciousness that are keeping us from being fully present and and distracted in some way to where I'm blocking my creativity or I'm blocking my alignment or whatever. So we would start the sessions or the meetings with what we call a check-in, where people take some time. Uh, could be just a couple of minutes, or if a person really had something going on, it could be more time to where somebody could let go of something so they could be more clear and come more present.
Which really speaks to me to another component, which is the kind of the idea of engagement. You really want people to be deeply engaged, which includes what we would call deep listening. Some of you may have seen the podcast we've done in the past, or you can look them up on listening skills and ownership language. Because a lot of times people are, quote, listening by just waiting to talk. When you're finished talking, I'll talk. Did I hear you? And did I hear you with empathy? So I'm really trying to see your point of view. We even would have things in the training where we would do engagement checks, like let's just stop and say, if the energy in the group is kind of dying, are people engaged? Maybe do another check-in. Maybe do something called a safety check, which, Jack, do you want to describe what that would be and how that might affect the energy of the group?
Yeah. Uh, One of the things that I've noticed is that when there seems to be a block, it's in my experience in working with groups and consensus trainings, it was almost always a safety issue that there's something going on inside where I might be reacting to somebody in the group, or I might be distracted by something, or there's something we're bringing up brings up something from the past. So if people have the opportunity to share, just like doing the check-in, to share at that point, what keeps me from being fully present?
Mm-hmm. And that also leads to some other things I think that can get in the way of that, which is that one of the things to be really mindful of, and this was tricky in business settings, which is egalitarianism, that everybody's voice and everybody's perspective really counts. Now, that doesn't mean that we're just sharing opinions and there's no opportunity to go and check things out, do research, reality check, what people are suggesting. This isn't just opinion, sharing. But it does mean that there's no positional authority. And that's why I said tricky in businesses, because sometimes the manager would be there with the team and people were used to just giving deference to their way of seeing it. And often I'd have to coach the managers. In this setting, it's really much more effective. And one of the trainings they had was listening up to their people and finding that the decision at the beginning would be like, meetings are just a waste of time. And then they started really valuing the information, the perspectives, and the kinds of solutions that people would come up with. Just like with the subcontractors, they had a perspective that other people in management who had the overview maybe didn't have. So the framework could say, we could do this differently and save you some money. And if they listened to that, they actually got the value. Egalitarian also means shared leadership. We're talking about it's not one person or a majority, but what do we mean by that? Often in this culture, we look at the leader being the one who makes the decision, says, come on, guys, follow me. How do you see that as being different, Jack? You want to describe that in your perspective?
In consensus, we look at, in terms of what you just said, the shared leadership, that everybody takes the leadership role. So it's not just listening to one person or one person who has to have ideas. The leader could be somebody who just says, okay, let's explore and see what we can come up with. So it's just the leader is really one who can facilitate getting the best ideas according to the criteria that we have.
And Lao Tzu had a quote like that. He says, if a really good leader, at the end, the people will say, we did it ourselves. They
Yes.
will have that, and they'll have that ownership, which is the other real advantage of a consensus process, is people are not just, nodding their heads to sign off. They've actually been invested in coming up with something that they are willing to commit with. They're not necessarily getting their preference. That's a really important trust point, is that we're not talking about everybody getting your preference and finding it. We might have to compromise. If we're sharing an office for Community Planet, I might want purple walls, you might want green walls. Maybe we decide, okay, beige will work for both of us. It's that kind of analogy where you want something that is more important that everybody can buy into the solution. And sometimes that makes for really creative solutions. You can't necessarily just go with what's on the top of your head. If you're wanting to create a solution, you might want to think out of the box, look at perspectives that maybe not are in the mainstream, going beyond the obvious. I think there's a way in your group, Jack, that somebody could kind of push that issue of creativity.
Yeah. Creativity is really the essence of consensus because we're looking for a solution that's seven generations, as we said, and a solution that's really going to work for everybody, including people who are, and the planet itself, nature, who are not necessarily there verbally speaking. But in our group, when we were looking at decisions, a couple of times, one of the intuitive people would say that we weren't there yet in terms of making a decision that the rest of us wanted to accept. And when it was not there yet, we had to go have fun and be creative and throw out solutions and eventually somebody would say something, we'd build on that, and then we get to something that was above where we were willing to settle before.
Yeah, I would, I do something really simpler when I would do the creative generative part of consensus, because there's a generation of ideas part, then you set criteria and then you can check and see what fits better and then keep massaging it. But when people would brainstorm, I'd give them 10 minutes to brainstorm ideas and they'd run it out and I'd say, oh, that's great. Now 10 more, at least 10 more. You got 5 more minutes. And the kind of ideas that would come forward were much more creative because it wasn't just like what was sitting there on the top of the head, it was stretching for that. So, and what you're saying about this isn't it is also not to be confused with blocking. If we're in the generative stage of ideas, we had this once and it really put a damper on, the whole group. It's like, you don't say, oh, that's not a good idea. I would block that. I would never buy into it. While we're still creating possibilities, before we've even discussed and explored them, you don't want to squash the energy. You want it to be this kind of flow. And, even like sometimes I say, what's the most absurd ideas you could come up with? Because it just goes beyond the mental blocks people have of what's acceptable. So we're getting towards the end of our time now. Anything else that value and diversity is another one I wanted to speak to, because when we're talking about everybody being engaged, not only diversity of perspectives, maybe not only diversity of people have different backgrounds and cultures and come with different mindsets, but also, especially in a group, some people by personality are introverts, some are extroverts. Extroverts speak by talking, they think by talking. Introverts have to think about something before they'll put it out. And if you don't understand that and honor it in a group, the extroverts can be talking and people will either give them more authority than they deserve, or they will think, well, these people are just talking off the top of their heads. They don't know what they're talking about, just want to hear themselves speak. In the meantime, the extroverts are saying about the introverts, well, they're not even participating. They're just sitting there. And if somebody doesn't create airtime for them, like saying, hey, Jack, what do you think of that? I had a construction group, a superintendent would sit there, 50 years of experience, not saying a word. Finally, I had to say, George, what do you think? George, what do you think? How is that in your experience? Finally, George would talk. 50 years of wisdom came out, flooding out, changing the whole perspective. But we needed to draw him in. So those kind of dynamics, all of these things that we're talking about are things that we work with people, train in the Community Planet training on consensus, but they're also just principles of approaches and attitudes that you can take when you're looking at this area. Um, you know, some attitude things I would include. Do I think I know the best outcome so I don't really listen? Do I block ideas instead of finding the creative ways? Do I trust that the group synergy can come up with a solution that honors everyone's concern? Am I willing to accept an idea that's not my first choice but serves the whole? Can I detach from my emotional investment in the issue so that I can process and be open to new ideas? The last one I want to mention, because we're going to do this as part of the closing like we always do, is that whenever the group we work with would get stuck, we would just take another centering moment, maybe evoke, our higher wisdom, maybe invoke spirit's guidance, however we saw that, and just allow for that greater wisdom of the divine energy within us and without us to be present as a place of speaking, especially if we want to do what we're talking about, not just agreement, but for us, consensus is alignment. It's alignment with the highest good of all concerned. And that goes way beyond just what we might decide we want and is comfortable on the personality level. So unfortunately, this is not only the end of this episode, but it's the last episode in this first series of podcasts that started last March. I'm going to be probably taking a little bit of a hiatus to do some writing and other projects. So keep in touch with the website. Tell us what you liked about the episodes, what you would like to see discussed from a higher perspective, what other kinds of show topics you might like to see, more interaction with viewers perhaps. And for this show, there's several freebies. As always, a free 15-minute consult for me. There's a free, all of this should be in the show notes. There's a free interview on consensus that goes into more depth on a lot of these concepts. The next online creative training we do on consensus, if you write to me and say the next, you'll get 30% off if you mention that you watch this podcast. And you can also get all of the wonderful ideas in Jack's book, The Next Evolution, A Blueprint for Transforming the Planet, by contacting him at www.communityplanet.org. That should be in the show notes as well, and I think in his bio. So what we're going to do is just the closing prayer that we always do. And I don't know, Jack, do you have any closing words other than that?
No, I think you've covered it well.
So again, let's just center in our divine essence. Again, close your eyes, put your hand on your heart, whatever works for you. Watch your breathing like we talked about in last episode. Just that rhythm of intaking the divine energy and then letting go of anything that you no longer need. And as you center and understand and connect with that divine light, love, peace, joy, however you experience it, breathe it in and now just breathe it out and send it to the Holy Spirit, the highest realms of light you can imagine, the greatest force in the universe, the oneness that we are. Just send it out to the world, to the ethers, to this universe to be used for the highest good of all concern, adding your energy as your contribution to creating a world for humanity to live with more love, peace, and joy, and offering your part of that. And thank you so much for being with us. I look forward to seeing you when we can connect again. And God bless you and peace. You have been listening to Soul Musings, exploring and embracing higher perspectives with me, Dr. Connie. Tune in every second Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific to learn how to use every experience for spiritual expansion and how to create the essence of the experience you want instead of the form. Learn about ways of living and working together that help build a more loving and cooperative world. Visit soulmusings.org to see more about what I offer and to book a 15-minute free consult.